All right, next topic, we're going to start learning a little bit more about bone fractures. In this particular video lecture, we're just going to talk about the classification of different types of bone fractures. In the next one, we'll discuss how the body repairs bone fractures. All right, so bone fracture classification. There are 4 either-or classification methods for bone fractures. First of all, fractures can be classified as non-displaced or displaced. This is pretty straightforward. If you have a breakage of the bone and the 2 pieces of the bone are still lined up properly, that would be a non-displaced fracture. If they're not, they're out of alignment, that's going to be a displaced fracture. And you may have heard those terms used before if you or anybody you know has broken a bone. Completeness of the break, this is pretty straightforward too. If the bone is completely broken all the way across, that's a complete fracture. If it's not broken all the way across, that's an incomplete fracture. Okay, also the orientation of the break. So if it's linear, if it's parallel to the long axis of the bone, so if we've got a bone here, and your fracture is like that, that's linear. A transverse fracture would be in that direction. And you'll also hear about oblique fractures. An oblique fracture would be on an angle like this, so it's not really linear and it's not really transverse. That would be called an oblique type fracture. And finally, this is important as well. Is the bone penetrating the skin? If it is, if the skin is open, that's called a compound fracture. If it's not, if the skin is still closed, it's a simple fracture. And hopefully you can recall from chapter 2 when we studied the integumentary system what some of the additional or what the major additional issue would be with a compound fracture versus a simple fracture. And no, it's not really going to be fluid loss so much. Yeah, of course, blood loss, fluid loss would be a concern in with a huge open gashing wound in a bone penetrating the skin. But what do you think would be the bigger problem if you just had a bone sticking out through the skin and fairly small wound, but that's still opening up the body to what? Hopefully you're thinking along the lines of infection. If you have a compound fracture, bone penetrating the skin, that is now an entry port for microorganisms that might cause infections deep within the body. Okay, and then your textbook has some pretty nice tables that just shows you some examples of common types of fractures, and also shows you some x-rays of some examples, which is pretty nice. First type, comminuted fractures. And what that means is you've got fractures of the bone, and the bone has been broken into several different pieces, like you see there on the diagram. Now keep in mind, a comminuted fracture, those types of fractures can be complete or incomplete. So the other types of terminology we were just covering can be applied to these bone breakages as well. Compression fractures, as the name might suggest, that's where your bone gets crushed, and it's not unusual for that to happen in the vertebrae. So there you can see there's a body portion of a vertebra that has been compressed or crushed due to an injury. So it would be a compression type fracture. Spiral fractures, these are fractures that occur when bones get twisted, and I don't know about you, but that just makes me cringe thinking about it. But a very common type of sports fracture. Common sports injury. And so you can see what that spiral fracture looks like, where the bone has gotten twisted. And that fracture is more on an oblique angle, so it's not really transverse and it's not really truly linear. It's on an oblique angle. In children and adolescents, you can have epiphyseal fractures. So that's where the epiphysis of a long bone, like they're showing you here, has separated from the diaphysis over there. And it's not so hard for that to occur because you've got the growth plate located there and that softer tissue. So sometimes, depending if you have a force that's applied to a bone, it might knock the diapesis right off of the epiphysis by tearing the growth plate. That's called an epiphyseal fracture. All right, a depressed fracture, like they're showing you here with the skull fracture, if the skull there received a blow to the head and the bony tissues actually got compressed down toward the brain, that would be a compression type fracture. That's also not very pleasant to think about. A green stick fracture, that's named for, if you think about, like if you're trying to bend and break a green twig and it really won't snap very easily, that's called a green, if that happens with the bone, it's called a green stick fracture. So that's an incomplete type fracture. More common in children. The bones of children tend to be a little less brittle because they're not quite as mineralized as the bones are in adults. So they've got more of those organic components, especially the one we talk about the most, the collagen fibers in there that help resist breaking. So when the bone of a child receives a blow from the side and it bends, it may be a little less likely to break completely all the way across, and that's called a green stick fracture. All right, that's just a little overview of some of the different types of fractures, and you can practice naming those and becoming familiar with those with some of the review activities that are available to you. The next video lecture will actually talk about what happens when a bone fracture needs to be repaired, and is some of the same concepts that we saw with bone development of the skeletal system are going to reappear here as we talk about bone fracture repair.